I wasn't present at the time, and to be honest with you, I forget the exact year. I forget the exact year that this happened. The only thing that I can tell you about it is that as my mother's grandfather, my mother was born in 1882, and so this would take place somewhere before the Civil War, probably in the 1840s. I would put it at that. It'd be at least in the 1840s. And at that time, I was on a Creek Road in Kent County and in Harwich Township, and there was only a handful of homesteaders there at that time, but they used to have to band together when they went out to put their crops in because they had clearings here and there and everything else was wooded. And they'd probably have a maybe 10 to a 20 acre tract here that had stumps was all removed, and then wherever they could find another flat piece they'd use that. So they'd band together and they'd all go to, they'd take their rifles out with them, and there'd be four of them that was standing guard while the other one was planting his crops, and then they go from the one place to the other. And so this day there was a band of what they called at that time roving braves. They were just young guys like the young guys today that you find that go out raising a lot of cane. And this was a band of about 20 to 25 young braves trying to get a feather in their hat and make a name for themselves. So they swooped down on the group that my mother's grandfather was working with that day, and they murdered all four of them, scalped all four of them. The skirmishes that started in the first place, the reason my mother's granddad got off as lucky as he did, he had just gone down to the creek to get some water for the other fellows that were doing they just used these old stone jugs, you know. They were originally whiskey jugs in the first place, but they used them for a water jug. They were a stone jug, and so he'd gone down there. So, and as he went down there, and the party in the first place only thought there was four of them. And then this other young brave, he went down there to for some reason to get a drink or something, and he saw him down there at the creek, so he rushed down to finish him off, and Granddad saw his reflection in the water as he come up on him. He saw his reflection and he ducked so he didn't get split down right down the skull. He got it down the side of the head, which knocked him colder than a mackerel, and young brave was so anxious to win his spurs, you know, that he grabbed him and scalped him, and away he went and left him there. And to go back to the tribe or the roving party, whatever it was, and show him that he'd picked up a scalp on his own, and he didn't have to share that with any of the other group, you see. Where the other group, when they'd go back to camp, well, they were just who did what or who did what. But this guy, he stood out all alone because he'd made his own killing all by himself. That'd be my great-great-grandfather. They scalped him and left him for dead, too. But he came to, and his head bleeding and everything, he crawled down to the edge of the old Jennet's Creek that still runs through the farms up there. And he crawled down to that old creek there and refreshed himself with a drink of water and I guess washed some of the blood off. Then he started to crawl from there back up. He thought he could make the road, and that would be maybe a quarter of a mile from the creek up to the road. And he thought it wasn't really a road; it was a trail through the bush, really, but they used it as a road. And so he crawled down. As he started to crawl back up there again, he could hear the braves talking, laughing, and coming through the woods there. He didn't know what to do. There was an old hollow log there that was just about the right size, so he backed down into that thing feet first and crawled back as far as he could so he'd be able to see if they went by or if they left or what they did. And since they were so good at reading up signs and tracks and disturbance of the leaves or nature, they were really trail finders. They came down to the creek and then they noticed there's only 4 bodies there. There should have been 5 and there's only 4 there. They've got 5 scalps, but there's only 4 bodies. So they began looking around. They finally found where he'd crawled down to the creek there. And but there'd been a little windstorm come up, a little whirlwind, what have you, that threw the leaves and everything all around, disturbed, covered up a lot of the trail that he had made getting in there. And I guess he had presence of mind enough to smooth the end of the log off or something when he come in. But fortunately, there was a great big spider. And while he was laying in the log there, wondering what the band was going to do, this spider spun a web across the mouth of this log. So finally they got around to looking at the log, and one of them even plunked something on the log. He didn't know what it was, what they hit the log with, but they hit it with something, and brought a lot of shower of rotten wood down his neck anyway, on his scalp there, and he didn't know that until the next day after his dad was cleaning him up, told him about all the rotten wood that was on his head, and then he remembered hearing the sound. And about the time they were going to investigate the log, chief or the head of this party told him, "No way, look at that, nobody go in that log with a spider web across there, they break the spider web." That's okay. So they left. Till after dark, he stayed in there till after dark then, and he crawled back up to the house. Crawled back up to the road and then wound his way from there through, and by that time his father and the rest of the people were out looking for them to see why they hadn't returned, and they found him. He'd passed out a couple of times on his crawl back. Anyhow, they that'd be my mother's father then. No, be my mother's great-grandfather. That'd be my mother's great-grandfather that took him up to the house then. That was in the very early spring, and the ewes were just lambing at that time. So he caught a fresh lamb, just dropped from the ewe, a fresh lamb, and he killed it and skinned it. And he took the skin off of the belly of the lamb, the belly part of the lamb, because that was tougher and it had a little hole in there so that the scalp would be able to breathe, you know. And the hole was made by the, well, I guess, what do you call it, the penis of the lamb or whatever it was. There was a hole, natural hole in there so that you didn't have to disturb it. And after bathing that scalp, you know, washing it off and getting the rotten wood off, the dust of the rotten wood off, and then he killed this lamb, and while it was still warm, slapped that warm pelt of the lamb right on top of his head. That's about the same thing as grafting a skin graft today, but back those days they knew how to, it was necessary to put fresh skin on if there was a spot, but where you got the skin from, it was wherever it was handy. So they slapped that on there, and that was on there for the longest time. And they, through this little hole in the top, they could check whether there was any infection or pus or anything in there. And I'm not sure whether they removed it periodically or what. I've lost that part of the story. That's or that part of the well, I guess you would have to call it a story, although it's the facts I should say. So after that healed, it healed like anything else does, about as ugly a scar as you'd want to witness, with wrinkles and veins and everything else into it. But it did heal. Hair never grew on it. And it was such an ugly looking top knot that Granddad, I'll call him Granddad to shorten the thing out, but Granddad always wore a cap. He had a nightcap when he went to bed, and he wore a cap on during the day, and if it got too hot, he'd push it to one side and then flip it to the other side, back and forward. And my mother was scared to death of her grandfather. His appearance just scared her to death. If he took the cap off, she was more frightened of him if he put the cap on. She wouldn't go near him if he offered her an apple or a piece of candy or something. He'd have to put it on the table or something and then sit back and wait for her to run in real quick and snatch it and take off. She wouldn't. She was scared to death of him. But however, he managed to live after being scalped by the Indian. He was one of the phenomena of the Creek Road there. He lived until he was 88 after he'd been scalped by the Indians. Well, Granddad was one of a family of 14. There were 7 boys and 7 girls in his family. And he was born on the old homestead, the Crafts homestead in Don Mills. And he grew up there as a boy and learned to fish and swim and hunt and all the things that a boy learns being brought up in the country back. And he was born in 1849, August 1849. And as a young boy, why, he seemed to be exceptionally active athletically, I guess you would call it. He could do all kinds of stunts wherever it acquired a test of strength or anything. Why, he could do it. Even when he was 14 or 15 years old, it wasn't unusual to have him doing a man's job on a barn raising or something where they needed a beam lift or held in place or all this type of thing. Well, get John on it, get John Kraft on it. Well, when he was 15, he heard about this wrestler with a side. They had a sideshow at Moravian Town. that was paying $25 for anyone would stay in the ring with their wrestler for 3 rounds. And Granddad heard about it and wanted to go. Well, I guess his mother and the rest of the boys didn't think that a 15-year-old kid would have a chance as a professional wrestler. But he decided he'd like to try for the 25. So he didn't have any boots that would stand him to walk that far. And his was pretty well worn out. And so he got up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and Ike, his older brother, who was 9 years older than he was, but Granddad's foot was as big as what Ike's was. So he fired Ike's boots out the upstairs window so that he wouldn't wake everybody up clumping downstairs. So he came downstairs in his stocking feet then and sneaked out the door and got Ike's boots on and walked or hitched a ride to the horse and buggy or wagon or whatever he could from Don Mills over to Raventown. And that was a trip, I believe, was around 12-15 mile hike across there.
Could you describe the things that were going on at the sideshow and all that they had, the games and
Oh yes, and at these different sideshows that they had at that time, they had all kinds of things. There's barkers out in front, and come on in and see the two-headed snake or the two-headed Indian, or they might have a sideshow up with a black behind a curtain there, with a skull cap on and a bunch of baseballs, and every time you hit the nigger in the head, you get a 5-cent cigar. Or there might be another one where you throw rings over a hoop for a baby doll or teddy bear or some such a thing as that. Rag doll of some description. They didn't have all the plastic dolls and stuff that they have today. They were just a crude thing. In fact, I have a bottle here that for 15 cents one of the squaws would completely wrap a beer bottle with sweet clover and put a top onto it for 15 cents. And she would completely weave that with sweet clover strands and completely surround that bottle. And I have one of those. And in fact, I'll show it to you before you leave. And so this wrestler then, they were offering, and in them days it's 25 cents to get in there. Now 25 cents was a heck of a price to pay but it was like watching a prize fight, and there was any number. There might be a dozen that would get in the ring and try for that kind of money. So, however, Granddad finally got there. After he got there, and he went to the ringside and registered whatever he had to do to get in the ring with this guy. Well, he knew nothing about wrestling. All he knew was brute strength, like grabbing a beam in the barn and throw it. That's all. So he got in the ring with him, and the guy started shadow boxing around him, looking for a hold, and Granddad didn't know anything about that. He just charged him and grabbed him like a grizzly bear would, and pulled him up to him and swung his arms around him and heaved a deep breath and let his chest you squeeze enough and breathe at the same time, and you've got a tremendous power there, And he liked to crack the guy's ribs, and he fired him right out of the ring after he felt the guy getting limp. Well, he just picked him up and threw him out of the ring. And then the guy wouldn't get back in. He said, no, he wouldn't get, that guy wasn't human. He wouldn't get back in with him, you know. Well, then the Barker, he wasn't going to pay him for, but the other people that were there, they told him, well, you're paying that kid there. We'll take you apart if you don't pay that kid. So they paid him, and but the guy wouldn't get back in with him. That was the end of that. So after he paid him, Granddad spent the rest of the time taking in whatever shows there was there. Why, someone told him about a baseball game that was being played over in Sarnia the next day, and that they were paying $5 for a pitcher, anybody that could pitch, and that they needed a pitcher. They had everything else on the team, but they didn't have a very strong pitcher. Well, again, Granddad knew nothing about throwing curves or sinkers or anything like that. All he knew that pick her up and throw her, that's all. And with the strength he had, why, it'd come at you like a bullet. It might be straight, but it was like hitting a bullet, you know. So he had hitched the ride and walked across there. And from Thamesville over to Sarnia, that's just about 40 miles across there. And so he made it the next day. I guess he traveled all night or walked all night or however. And he pitched the game the next day and won the game the next day for the Sarnia team. I've forgotten who they were playing against, but Sarnia was playing against St. Thomas or somebody like that. And so then, after he another instance that he heard about, they were paying a pretty good price for a raccoon, and they had some kind of a contest on. The one that got the most raccoon was giving some kind of a prize, or they were whatever it was. It seemed like an awful lot to him. So he and a couple of the other boys heard of a man up near Thamesville that had a real sharp coon dog, as they called him those days, a coon dog. And that was the principal thing when it come to hunting, was to get a dog that knew how to hunt. A dog that really knows how to hunt a coon. Why, he just, as soon as he picks up his scent, he just cuts a circle around him. And if the coon is still inside of that circle, he hasn't hit his spoor yet, so he just keeps, like a corkscrew, just keeps going in closer and closer and closer, and finally he's got the raccoon cornered, and then he'll start to bark, and you go to the bark, and he's either got the coon backed into a corner on the ground, or else he's got him up a tree. Another thing is, this happened was a skunk. A skunk is something that's unbelievable, you know, for a dog that don't know the difference between the spoor of a skunk and the spoor of anything else. And you'll never know it because the skunk doesn't leave his scent until he's ready to defend himself. There's no more scent to a skunk walking through the grass than there is a rabbit or a raccoon, but he has a different spoor, just the same as people have a different spoor. Well, one of our neighbors, a skunk my granddad had a trap set for a skunk, and he caught the skunk in the trap, and the skunk had pulled the trap down in the hole after him. Well, a skunk isn't going to throw that scent all over and get it all over his hide, you know, unless there's an animal or a human or somebody to throw it at. He's not going to throw it at a trap or at the ground or a bush, but he's going to do his darndest to see if he can work his way out. So a skunk had pulled himself down in the hole, and the trap had held him so that all that was sticking out was his tail and his rear end. And those Coulters had a dog. They hadn't had him too long, and he wasn't too well versed, you know. And Granddad had this trap set at the cradle in the hole. Well, it'd be like, say the line fence here is at Greenfield, you know, and just a few blocks the other side was the other house there. The dog out running around the yard, and he smelt something, you know, and he come down to see what it was, and and this skunk's rear end is white, like it's about the size of a quarter and like a silver dollar when he's got his tail up, you know. And when his tail is up, he's ready to shoot anything that comes along. As long as his tail down, well, you don't have to worry about a thing, because he isn't going to shoot his own tail. So this dog run up and seen this nice silver spot, you know, and run up and stuck his nose against it. Well, that dog he was completely sick and blinded that skunk let him have it right up both nostrils and in the eyes and everything. They practically had to bury the dog and barnyard juice to get the smell of the skunk off.
Getting back to the story of your granddad and the raccoons. Once they got the dog, then going out after the raccoons.
Oh yes, and that year they got over 100 raccoons with this dog too. He was really a well-trained raccoon dog.
You had told before about him getting the dog and
where he caught the dog. Oh well, that was when they went to get this dog. Well, they called it borrowing him, you know, for 3 months for the hunting season. Anyway, they called it borrowing him because they did take him back after he got through. But they found out that this dog was habitually chasing every rig that come down the road there, whether it's a buggy, horse and wagon, or what. And he'd creep along and lay on his belly and hide on the side of the road, and then he'd spring up when the horses come along and scare them and jump them sideways, and that was a great game with him, you know, to startle somebody, and sometimes the horses run away with you. And so these two guys and my granddad, they went up to get this dog there, and they had a team of horses, span of horses they called them those days, on this buckboard. And it's like the buckboard is really a wagon with buggy wheels on it, with halfway buggy wheels onto it. It's something like what you call a truck today. Got a covered body, and then it's got a box on the back of it that you can put things in to carry, you know, grain and stuff and all manner of things. So they took this. It has a tailgate on it too, so they dropped the tailgate down, and Granddad rode on the back of the wagon on the tailgate there. And when they got up within a quarter of a mile of this place, why, he got out and walked on down to the gate. The dog never bothered anybody on foot, anybody walking, or a horse walking, a cow walking. He didn't bother them.
Yeah.
Well, this dog was trained in the art of tracking a raccoon, or how to cut corners, because a dog can wear himself out if he just starts and follows a hot raccoon track and goes every place the raccoon went. Why, he'll lose him at times, because the raccoon went up a tree and went out a limb and jumped from one limb across to the other and come down on the other side, or or do anything to get across a pond of water without swimming it or wading through it, in certain times of the year. And so that's where the dog would lose him. But a smart raccoon dog, the minute he hits a hot trail, he'll just start right out in a circle and cut a big, wide circle, depending on how the spoor tells his nose how long since that raccoon was there. You cut a big, wide circle, and if he don't come across a raccoon spoor in that circle, he'll just keep making the circle smaller, like a corkscrew, and making it smaller until he eventually knows, well, I got the raccoon right inside here, and then he'll start closing in on him and either tree him or back him up against a log or something where he's got to fight. He hasn't got room to go from the log to the tree before the dog will nail him, or else he'll. And of course, if he's out head first with them claws, well, there's no dog going to go up there and stick his nose out there. He's liable to lose his eyes. So if he's a smart coon dog, so that's the difference between a dog that's not trained for raccoon and a lot of dogs that aren't trained for raccoon. They'll start on a raccoon trail and a rabbit crossed the trail. Well, they're just liable to quit the raccoon trail, and you'll end up with a dog barking and you got a rabbit in a hole someplace and your raccoon's gotten away. So there really is a marked difference between one that's trained and one that isn't. I believe that I'm right on that. There was 2 cents a rail that they got for splitting. And so Granddad had split rails all winter long and had a huge pile of rails there. And when it got, as soon as the winter was over, where it was time to put do the plowing and put the crops in, why, then there was no more rail splitting, so that's when you always kept track of your tally, and like 5 rails would be a dime, so you'd take your axe or whatever it was, and you'd make 4 cuts, and then put a cut through them, and that's the way you kept tally on your stump. You'd pick out a particular stump, and you'd keep your tally on top of that stump. And when they come to pay off, why as the guy that had hired him, for some reason or other, he wouldn't pay him the full price, and of course there was nothing in writing. It was just a verbal contract in the beginning at so much, and so he could either take it or leave it. So he took it, whatever it was, but he figured that the guy beat him out of $5 or $6 or what have it. So that summer, then that spring, after it began thunder and lightning, and during the thunder and lightning season, one dark night, they don't know how that the wind just happened to blow all these old dead leaves up into that rail pile, but for some reason or other, the wind just decided to pile all them leaves against the end of the rails, and then lightning struck the leaves and set them on fire and burned up the biggest part of the pile of rails there. So it was never proven, but of course Granddad always got the blame for setting the rails on fire, but he always could deny it that it was the lightning, because there was a lot of lightning that night. Well, then after he grew to be a young man, well, he met my grandmother. She used to go over to Dresden, and I was working in Dresden. She worked at the hotel in Dresden, a 16-bed hotel there, and she used to make the beds. They were all feather ticks, and you had to stir up the feather ticks and turn the mattress over and put the new sheets on and everything like that, and shake up the pillows, open them up and let them hang out the window to air, you know, and even in the wintertime you hauled your mattress over and hung it out the window to air, one end of it, and then pull that end in and kick the other end out. And so there was quite a bit of work to keep her occupied there. And in fact, I have the first money she ever earned. It's a 2-cent piece. She the first day that she worked there, why the hotel owner gave her dinner and 2 cents for making all of these 16 beds. So she took it home and showed it to her dad that she'd made this 2 cents, you know, and boy, that was quite a bit of money. So he told her, he said, well, Mariah, he said, if you put that away and keep it, you'll never die broke. So she kept it until the day she died, and she left it to me when she. So I still got it, and so that's where she met Granddad. She met Granddad while she was at Dresden, and they were married in 1972. 1872, and they lived around Dresden and Don Mills there for almost a year, and then they heard tell of a place that was for rent. It was a rent in this way, that there was a nice house on the place, and the man that owned it, and I've forgotten his name, and I don't know where I could find that now, that they could have the house to live in. They had a house to live in and everything, and so much a month to come and work there. So he worked there for about 3.5 years, I think it was, that he worked at, well, it was longer than that. I should take that back, because it was much longer than that. Because my dad was born there in 1877, and Aunt Audrey was born there in 1881. She was born there 4 years. She was 4 years after my dad was born. So about 1881, they were home to visit at Kent Bridge, and while visiting there, Granddad took a trip out to Dresden to see if there's any of the old gang there and what have you, and they'd been trying to persuade him to come out there. They still knew that he was about as powerful a man as he ever was, and there was a bully around Dresden there that was coming into the bar and looking for a fight and trying to cower everybody in the place. So Granddad went out this night, and he and another group were sitting there playing cards when this guy came in, and he went up to the bar and had a drink, and then turned around looking the crowd over, and he saw Granddad and come over and wanted to know where he was from. But he was, and I suppose Granddad told him that it was none of his business where he was from, or word to that effect. And if anyone addressed him in that kind of a tone, I'm sure he got that kind of an answer. However, this guy was spoiling for a fight, and it so happened that he just picked the wrong guy this night, and it wasn't long until they was squared off at each other and was into it, and Granddad finally got him and what they called crotched him. He just got him by the shoulders and reached down and grabbed him by the crotch and picked him clear of the floor and threw him against the wall in the corner. And when he did, the guy didn't get up. He stayed there. So they went on, finished their game of cards, and said goodnight and took off for home. And somewhere during the night, I presume around 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, a friend of Granddad's that he'd grown up with at Don Mills there, a man by the name of Dow Snary. And Dow was a big, strong fella too, but he still was no match for Granddad. And his brother Chet told me personally that years later that my Granddad was the most powerful man that he'd ever seen around there. And Chet was another man that was well over 6 foot and weighed over 200 pounds. So when those guys tell you about somebody being powerful, well, you kind of pay attention to it. And so, however, sometime during the night, Dow rode up to the house there, and he hammered on the door, and he said, John, he said, you got to get out of here. He said, they're coming after you. He said that guy died. Well, he didn't say this guy. I think his name was Dillon. I'm not sure of that. It may have been Rubel or something, but this took place at the Glassford House. The hotel where this took place was the Glassford House. Well, it was about 4 o'clock in the morning when Dow Snary come riding up to the house to tell Granddad that he better get out, that he'd have to leave, that they were coming after him, that the guy had died and they'd found him about 50 feet from on the sidewalk. It was a board sidewalk. It was just planks. It wasn't no sidewalk really, just planks to keep out of the mud. And they'd found him on the walk, let's call it that. They'd found him on the walk about 50 feet from the Glassford Tavern entrance there. So he said, they're coming after you, and he said, Von Gunton, I believe his name was, he was a big Prussian. He was a constable there at the time, but whether he was coming after him or whether it was friends of this other guy, I'm vague on that. And however, he got up and got dressed, and my grandmother got up and packed him a lunch or whatever they had there, and mostly bread. If you had a slice of that bread, well, you were all set. It would stay with you for hours. And they'd cut it a good inch thick, so he and Dow already had his horse, so Granddad went out and grabbed a horse out of the stable there, and they took off there. At that time, if you got into the States, you were free from prosecution. Even if you was a murderer, you was free. The same way, if you got from the United States into Canada, you were free. That's why there was so many of the slaves that if they get into Canada, they were free. They were out of the reach of American jurisdiction. So the shortest distance to get to the States was to go Sarnia way, right across to Sarnia and cross into Port Huron. Was much shorter than it was to come to Windsor down that was. So they took the shortcut and they rode until they felt that their horses were beginning to tire, and again, if you take a horse too far away from home, you may have trouble finding your way back, but they took him to where they were quite sure they could get back, which they did. And then they turn them around, hit them a slap on the rump, and head them for home, and they'll go home. So they got across to Port Huron, but I don't know how they got across. Whether they because there was no blue water bridge at that time, and whether the ferry run at that time of the night or morning, I don't know how they got across. Maybe it's possible that they just picked up a rowboat and rowed across to the other side. But then they worked their way from Port Huron to Detroit, and then from Detroit through to Chicago, and from Chicago through to Omaha, and from Omaha, then they started heading north to get up as near the border of Canada as they could. They were still both very loyal citizens to Canada, and they didn't want to give up their birthright or anything by leaving Canada, but they wanted to get as far away as they could until this thing cleared up, or if it ever cleared up. So they eventually ended up at either Seattle or Tacoma, Washington, because they worked in both places. That was all lumbering business at that time. Huge lumbering business, and they both could handle a crosscut saw and saw all day long, and split wood and all that type of thing. They were muscular and trained for that type of thing. Well, then after several years, I'm talking about 3 or 4, maybe 5 years, and they hadn't heard anything from about the trouble back home, that they had any suspicion as to where they were. And I don't know, I probably should have told you previously that Uncle Ike, that the boys all chipped in and raised a stake of around $200 for Ike, and Ike was going to get caught up to the see what was left of the '49 gold rush there,
Yeah, we have that. We have that on the other.
So they eventually worked their way into British Columbia, and my granddad, I guess if things had been different to what they were, he'd have probably stayed in British Columbia the rest of his life, because I've heard him say many times that it was the nearest thing to heaven that he was ever at, that the climate and everything. You never even went in out of the rain, winter or summer. If it rained, you just kept on going, and you never changed clothes. Your clothes would dry off on you, and that's the way it was. And he was always head of some lumber crew someplace. He would be head of the crew, and it wasn't how much you knew about the lumbering or the getting logs to the river or stream or wherever you were, as it was when you were the boss of the crew. It was you had to be able to whip anybody in the crew, because if you wanted to lose, you let somebody come in there and take over. All he had to do was say he wasn't going to do this or wasn't do that, and knock hell out of the boss. He had the job. So anyway, he kept the job. I never heard tell of him losing the job. He might have lost a few for all I know, but I've never heard anyone that ever lost a job yet. So after they were there for I believe it was around 7 or 8 years, why they decided that they would like to be a little closer to home. Granddad especially was beginning to worry about his kids and his wife and what have you. And but he was able to write down to get correspondence down to Ike, and then Ike would address the letters to Aunt Sarah. He never addressed his envelope his wife, but the letter itself was for her, but the address on the envelope was always to Aunt Sarah. And in that way, why Mag they couldn't come to her and accuse her of what do you call it, of harboring a criminal or something like that, or withholding evidence or anything like that. See, because he wrote to Aunt Sarah, and then they'd destroy the letters as soon as they read them and got them. He sent them money, whatever he could afford, a couple of dollars at a time, maybe a $5 bill at a time. And one time when Aunt Audrey was about, I guess she was about 10 or 11 years old, this envelope came, and it was stuffed quite big, and it was getting near Christmas time, and Daddy'd sent her a whole lot of money, and she was hopping around with that envelope, and finally they opened it, and there was only a couple of dollars in it, and it was stuffed with some dried venison and stuff that he thought would be a treat, near Christmas time. So she was quite put out that it wasn't money. She, like a kid will, she could envision shoes and clothes and everything else with it, But, however, they worked their way then back down along the border, and they stayed pretty close to the border, like beyond the Saskatchewan and then into North Dakota, and then from North Dakota back into Saskatchewan. They finally got down as far as Winnipeg. And when they got down to Winnipeg, why, Dow decided he wasn't coming any farther. He was going to stay there. So Granddad stayed with him for a year or so, and they stayed in Winnipeg, and then Granddad left, and he worked his way on through to Niagara Falls, Buffalo and Niagara Falls, and then came across into Ontario, and he finally found his spot and a job he liked, and he thought he was fairly close to home and also close enough to the border that he could slip back and forwards across the border there. And that was at Grimsby, all around Grimsby, and that was quite a lumbering center at that time. In fact, it was solid forest at that time. And so he took a contract with some lumber company there, and those days, if you broke a contract, they didn't owe you a cent. You had to fulfill your contract. So he
just that,
yeah.
So he had to fulfill his contract.
Oh yeah. So you had to fulfill your contract, or they didn't pay you. So in the meantime, this bartender at the Gillespie House there, he became ill and knew he was going to die, and on his deathbed there, why, he acknowledged the fact that he was the one that killed this guy. That the guy woke up after Granddad and the gang had left. He woke up and he was still, whether he was out of his head, from the blow, maybe he'd died anyway, for all anybody knows, I guess. But anyway, when he woke up, he just started smashing everything that there was around there. So it hadn't affected his strength any, and he started busting up the whiskey glasses and beer glasses and knocking bottles off the shelf and stuff. And the guy reached around and crowned him over the head with one of those big oak bungs out of the barrel. And knocked him out, and he went down again. And lay there. The guy cleaned up the mess and then apparently grabbed him and dragged him out and dragged him 20 feet or so away from the door of the hotel and then left him on the boardwalk there, and they found him, and he was dead when they found him. So the physical aspects of the case was that the guy got up and left to come home and dropped dead after he got there. And no one ever, they didn't have all of these ways to check things like they did before. And everyone knew that Granddad had pitched him, but they knew nothing about this guy hitting him over the head with the barrel, and the guy cleaned up everything that was smashed up around there, put it back into place before he went home. So the evidence was, that part of it was pretty well wiped out. So, and he admitted that he was the one that was the cause of it. Well, when they immediately notified my grandmother and people there that John was exonerated, and if she knew where he was, to get word to him to come home. Of course, she even denied then that she didn't know anything about it, because if she said, "Oh yeah, I'll let him know right away," that she didn't know whether it was a hoax to get her or not. So she still didn't know anything about him. But however, they let him know immediately, and of course they still had to go to California, and then from California back. And
the letters.
The letters, and it was letters those days, written with the old goose quill and a bottle of ink, and so when he got word, and it said in there for him to come home, well, he still wasn't sure but what they were. He was sure that it was Ma's handwriting and everything, but he wasn't sure but what they were hoaxing her, you see. So he wrote back and he said that he wouldn't be home for a while. He had to have further proof on that. And couldn't she come up and see him? Told him where it was at Pembroke, or at the Grimsby. And so Aunt Sarah went. Instead of Ma going, well, Aunt Sarah went. And Ma was always just a little bit jealous of her, I think, at that time, because so when she went down, well, of course, it took a couple of days to get there those days, too, You had to take a train, go into Niagara Falls, and then from Niagara Falls get back out to Grimsby. You couldn't go right direct to Grimsby. You had to get transportation from there out. So it'd take a couple of days to get there and a couple of days home. But Ma thought she was gone too long, and whether she thought there was a little hanky-panky going on or what, well, nobody knows. You don't know anything about those things. But however, after he was convinced that it was the truth, well, then he came home after that. And I think you have the letter. I think you have the letter on the tape that I read to you, where he was considering having Dad go down there and work with him on this, and he couldn't come home until his contract was finished, or he wouldn't get paid. And it entailed quite a sum of money on those contracts, They give you a living wage. In other words, it was like in the Army. You didn't have to worry about where you're going to sleep or where you're going to eat. But it's where's the money coming from afterwards, you see. And that's what I mean. They didn't. You still had your living all that time, and your clothes. That's what they called found, When you had your when you got so much a month in found. Why they called it that, I don't know. But when you were found, that meant that you got a year's clothing and a pair of shoes or two pair of shoes, whatever you needed for that length of time. That was found. Otherwise, you were working for a wages or so much a day. But if you were found, that meant that you got everything up to there, and then whatever you agreed on in money after that again. So he eventually came, like I say, he eventually came home and got settled, and as anyone would tell you, that that's not unreasonable. And when a knock came to the door, sure, May opened the door. She don't know who the hell's standing there because there was no definite time or day or anything else as to when he'd come. And it could have been him or it could have been Joe Dotes. I mean, when you look through the, was that the doorbell? When you look through you can't look through a door to see who's on the other side. You might think you know who's there. Might be somebody altogether. I think this is Natalie, but I'm not sure.
Coming to the door and
where he finally did get home, and naturally he came to the door where she had no idea what day he was coming or anything like that. So when she opened the door, well, he stood there. Well, they had both changed in 15 or 16 years' time, you know, where you change so that in fact he had a beard, and she had never seen him with a beard before, and of course she was a full-fledged woman by that time, you know, and she had changed from being a young girl, I guess, to being a middle-aged. I guess you're middle-aged when you're in your 30s and 40s. You're middle-aged because at 80, why you're getting up there. So I think 30 or 40 is your middle-age. So, however, they carried on from there then, and Granddad took care of not only Aunt Sarah, but of his father-in-law and mother-in-law. He took care of them right up until they died, and took care of the funeral expenses and all of that. And he, after my dad got married, a year after my dad got married, why, they built the house that Delbert's living in now. My granddad built the living room part of it. He didn't build the kitchen part of it there because that came on later. But when we boys were living at home there, when we were all living at home, there was just the one big living room and kitchen, and the two bedrooms was all the room that we had at that time. And then later the kitchen and the other bedroom was added on.